All right, welcome everybody around the world. Welcome to all my subscribers. So for this video here, this is one of many videos that I'm doing as part of this series. Overall, it's a large amount of information to cover, so I've broken it down so far into a few different little videos. Each video approaches it from a different type of perspective or approach. There will be a mega video coming out soon where I'll just go through everything in one go. That'll be very long, and I want to work on how I'm going to word that and everything a little bit better. But for today and with this video, this will be a scope. I've had about an extra week to think about how I've already worded it in the videos I've done so far, and how I could improve the way I explain things, how I could speed up the explanation, and so forth. So with all that week of better preparation on how to more efficiently explain this, that's the purpose of this video, is to be able to relay that. So this will be a scope of the evidence and the reasonings. I won't be making it lengthy by reading all of the quotes, reading all of the the scripture and everything. I won't go into great and graphic detail of things. This will be an overall scope and the reasonings as to why Jesus is the Messiah. Of course, the Unitarian Jesus, non-Trinitarian Jesus, not the Trinitarian mainstream Christianity Jesus, but the proper scriptural theological one. But anyway, so to get this first hump out of the way, this is something I have to mention in the series and every one of the videos. I've already written and published about 5 years ago now, Systematic Theology. It's also, I have well over 100 and something videos on various teachings from that on my channel here. I can, and it's separate to this topic, so I'm not getting into it and wasting time on it here. But all the theological things that pertain to could Jesus be the Messiah are not part of this topic focus. The focus of this topic is proving that Jesus is the Messiah. In terms of proving whether Jesus did or didn't defy this or that, did he uphold, did he defy the Torah, did Jesus bring a new religion, and all that type of stuff, I can explain that, but that's for another time. I don't want to add another hour onto this video here. But all that information, I feel I can confidently prove at any debate or argument using my systematic theology that Jesus did not defy or replace or extinguish or end anything. He upheld and he reinforced. He upheld and reinforced the law, the Torah, Judaism. He did not replace it, ended anything like that there. He did not create a new religion. He literally, the true Christianity, as I show in my systematic theology, is Judaism for Jews and Gentile law for Gentiles. This is what Jesus taught, what the New Testament teaches. That's contrary to mainstream Christianity, but that's because that is an error. And the external opinions of Christianity, especially from Judaism, is very, very poor because they're vastly basing their opinion of Christianity on mainstream, which is Trinitarian Christianity. But I can explain, but that's not what this video or this topic is for, right? But I can prove that Jesus did not defy anything. So all those other things that Judaism typically thinks Jesus is disqualified over, I can explain, no, he's not. And I'm quite sure that if anybody from Judaism, any rabbi, sat down with me, spent enough time to listen to the evidence as I should, they would most likely shake my hand and say, okay, fine, yes, I agree with you on this. But what they wouldn't agree on is Jesus being the Messiah. They might say, okay, fine, Jesus didn't defy this, he didn't replace this, fine, it's like you say, but why is Jesus the Messiah? Why should I believe he is the Messiah? He died. He didn't attain world peace in his day. I mean, all these things that Judaism typically says, right? So I'm leaving those more minor theological matters outside of this topic and focusing on, disregarding those things. What things make Jesus, verify Jesus as being the Messiah? Because we all know, yes, he did die. Does him dying disqualify him from Messiah? Okay, does Tanakh say that Messiah would die? These are the things that pertain to this topic focus. They're the basis of my overall study and presentation in this series. Okay, so a simplified scope as to why, and considering, like I said, Jesus upheld and reinforced as the Messiah should do. He did not replace, he did not bring something new, he did not defy what was, so forth, so forth. Okay, considering that, what makes Jesus the Messiah? Well, as I can show with the verses that I have already read in the other videos in this series, and a few more that I've obtained since in the last week. As I can show from the verses, which are everything that I'm using for this presentation is from the Tanakh only. Nothing is from the New Testament, right? And from the Tanakh, from the prophets, we can see numerous different prophets all use specific key terms, terms that are not widely used throughout the Tanakh. And these prophets, as I show and categorize the different statements that the various prophets make, they all use the same key terms. And these key terms they use sometimes in conjunction with other key terms. Sometimes there's 2, 3, 4 key terms, shared key terms between different passages from the different prophets. And as I showed, these things that they are speaking about, because in a sense they're isolating these key terms to the certain passage and verses in particular, they're talking about an event or a figure or whatever it is they're talking about. This is like concentrating and highlighting something important, right? And what I showed in the other video is that these verses from the prophets show us that the Messiah would indeed come before the fall of Israel. And the fall of Israel occurred, as we know, 66 to 70 AD. Let's just say 70 AD for simplicity's sake going forward. Okay, so we know Israel fell in 70 AD. Now, the question of whether Jesus is Messiah or not, well, I just want to point out something first, that Jesus did not cause the fall of Israel, right? If Jesus was, so the reason I'm saying that is because Christianity would say, well, Jesus was the Messiah. Judaism says, no, he wasn't the Messiah. But what history shows is that Israel still fell anyways, right? And Jesus didn't make Israel fall. It also fell 40 years after Jesus died anyways. But Jesus didn't make Israel fall. And especially if Jesus was a fraud, like Judaism says, he was a phony, he wasn't the real deal, however you want to put it, then he certainly wouldn't have any type of miraculous, supreme sorcerer power to make Israel fall 40 years after his death, especially if he was just a fraud, standard human phony, right? My point being is that Israel fell. That's what happened, and that's what would have happened, irregardless of whether Jesus was the Messiah or not. My point in that is that they're two separate things. They have nothing to do with one another directly whatsoever. Okay? And the reason I'm saying that and highlighting that is because since we know Israel fell, then when we see in the various prophets that it says that the Messiah would be here and also that he would die before the fall of Israel, okay, or, at that time, not vastly before, not vastly after, but, like at the time of the fall of Israel, we would see the arrival and the death, the departure of the Messiah. I can show that from the Tanakh. This is my point. Judaism does not believe this. They do not believe that Tanakh says Messiah comes before the fall of Israel. That's why for my study in this presentation, I tried to think outside of the box, a whole new, different approach, unique approach that I think nobody else has made before. I've watched virtually every debate between Christianity and Judaism, and in my opinion, Judaism wins all of the debates. Most of the time, they're always against Trinitarians, but even if they weren't, they'd probably still win the debate. And that's because they just have better counter arguments. But who is absolutely right? So in order to win the debate, so to speak, I would have to find unique evidence and a unique approach that hasn't been made before, that is not cliche, that is totally new, okay, but valid, right, in striking and important ways. So like I said, the Tanakh, if we look, for example, without reading all the verses to save time, again, this is just a scope video, right? I don't want this to be lengthy. But for example, in Malachi, we are told that, and I might misquote some of the terms in this and that. Again, I'm not quoting the verses right now, right? But the essence is that in Malachi, we are told that who is the Messiah would be coming. Now, that could be argued. Some may argue against that. right? But as I can show, the key terms that are used in Malachi are also used by the other different passages speaking about this Messiah figure by the prophets, okay? And one thing that we see, a pattern, is that various prophets do say Messiah would be present before the fall of Israel. So, like I was saying, in Malachi, it's talking about, it mentions the Lord will enter the temple. Okay, now this could only be the second temple because this is prior to or along with the fall of Israel when God will smite the land, it says in Malachi, before I have come and utterly smitten the land. And I verified by looking at the Hebrew term there used, searching the Tanakh for the usage of that Hebrew term for smite, and found other examples where God is using the same Hebrew term in regards to punishing Israel and smiting them, the land, for whatever particular thing, right? For some disobedience or whatever, right? So nobody could say, oh, well, smiting the land doesn't mean what you think, because no, it definitely does mean that. So Malachi is saying that before God comes and smites the land, and that's a condition-based thing. It's not guaranteed to be smitten if Israel reforms and whatnot, right? Which is also what Daniel describes in chapter 9. But Malachi tells us that God revealed that he would come and utterly smite the land. But before that occurs, he would send, Elijah to do what he would do. And he would send this other figure, okay? And this other figure is called a messenger, a malach, okay? And it mentions covenant as well. This is something I mentioned in one of my other videos. That's one of the other key terms. So in these so-called true Messiah verses, some of which others have not really highlighted before, but I'm doing in my presentation, these verses I feel can be proven to be about the Messiah because they all use the same key terms, okay? Somewhat unique terms that are not widely found elsewhere in the Tanakh. Some of them are quite unique to these, okay? And it's not that every one of the passages that I have all share the exact same terms. Some match on one or two, some match on a bunch. It's a little, it's not that it's disorganized, it's not that it's erratic, but it's not like I have 10 passages and each of the 10 passages uses the exact same 4 terms. This is my point, right? It's a little bit varied in how it goes, right? But with Malachi, we see the term messenger, and that's, I'm just pointing that out. That's not one of the terms mentioned in any of my other sources for my evidence, right, from the Tanakh. But it mentions messenger. That's relevant from a theological perspective, but that's not part of this presentation, so that's irrelevant, right? But it mentions messenger, it mentions covenant, this messenger of the covenant, right? That might seem pointless by itself, but when you see that the other passages that I have also mention what is a Messiah figure bringing or coming along with a covenant, okay, it becomes more relevant, right? So it mentions the messenger, mentions messenger, it mentions covenant, right? But all of this is happening before Israel is smitten, okay? And we know Malachi 3 and 4, it's about, these figures, Elijah and the other figure, are going to come and help teach the people essentially to reform before God comes and utterly smites the land, okay? And where it says messenger and covenant, it then says that the Lord will enter the temple. This could only be the second temple. And that's why it's fairly argued, even by other scholars, that this proves that this is pinpointing the time period of the second temple and that the Messiah must be here at the time of the second temple. But you cannot prove that Malachi 3 and 4 are about the Messiah just using Malachi 3 and 4. You have to cross verify it with the other passages like I've shown elsewhere, right? One of which is Daniel 9. So Daniel 9, another one that Judaism would argue with. They would say that that we have the calendar wrong and that the Hebrew interpretation of the true calendar shows it being 100 and something years off from Jesus. Jesus died in 27 AD or thereabouts, if you want to argue, right? Judaism says, oh no, well, Daniel's 490-year prophecy ends 100 and something years off, so it couldn't be Jesus, right? Furthermore, Judaism doesn't believe that Daniel 9 is about the Messiah. They believe it's just some anointed guy, okay? And they also argue that being cut off doesn't necessarily mean dying. So for these core reasons, they argue against Christianity, against Jesus being Messiah, when we're talking about Daniel 9. However, I have a counter argument for each of these points. Number one, it can be proven And this is no disrespect to Judaism or anything, right? But it can be proven that the Hebrew calendar, and not the whole duration of the Hebrew calendar, but it comes a point where an error was made in their counting, but it's correct for thousands of years up till that point. But it can be proven and has been proven, and by scholars, not just by myself. It has been proven that the calendar, that the date that they have now is an error, because at some point in history an error was made, and the error has been identified by scholars as being the length of rule of this Persian period. And history and records from history show that it was around 200 and something years, but in Judaism they hold it to be 50 or 50 something years. That vastly shortens it. There's also a discrepancy in the Tanakh over a verse that talks about 400 years in Egypt or 430 years. We have that as well. But to simplify things, the missing years, as it's called, is why there is a discrepancy from the Hebrew calendar to the standard calendar. Okay, but even the scholars, doing my study on the, I have it in one of my other published books, when I did the chronology, going through the Bible, adding up all the numbers that are supplied in the verses, my tally matched exactly to what Judaism offered. Like, I had it open on various different Jewish sources, and it matched year for year for thousands of years until when Joseph was born. And then there was a difference, right? But it matched all the way up to the Exodus. It matched even after that for a chunk of time, right? But also when you have, them holding the Persian rule as being 50 instead of 200 years, you're going to have that as well, that problem. So altogether, that's why their calendar is off. But it's not accurate. There are mistakes made. When you get to the point in the Bible timeline chronology, it's arithmetic that's needed all the way up until Joseph is born. When Joseph is born, you have to use algebra, okay? And it was complicated, but when I did my research, I looked at other opinions, I tested various different theories and opinions, and math doesn't lie. And using the algebra, I could verify and prove how old, I think Jacob was when he had Joseph. Okay, and forgive me if I got the names wrong, right? But when Joseph was born, how old was his father when Joseph was born? Okay, that can be proven using numbers supplied in other Tanakh verses about people, places, and things at that time, and using algebra, you can solve it. Okay, how old the father was when he had Joseph, right? So, anyways, that's a minor point, but it can be proven using that evidence in conjunction with the error that they've made in the length of the Persian rule. Okay, so Judaism says that that the first temple fell in around 420 something BC, when history and records show that it was 586, 587 BC. So they have that 100 and something year difference that's manifest even right there. Okay, so when they're doing the mathematics, the arithmetic for Daniel 9, with the 490 years and with the 483rd year marker when the anointed one is cut off, they're basing their maths around a calendar and a time frame that is 100 something years off. So when Judaism makes the argument that, oh, well, Daniel 9 couldn't even be about Jesus, even if it was about Messiah, because the timing is off. But I'm sorry, the first temple did not fall in 420 something BC. So it can be proven, and I'm not going to waste more time on this one singular tiny point, but it can be proven that their Judaism's argument on that aspect is wrong, right? So in a fair argument, my side would win in that, right? It can be proven. Okay, so the takeaway from that is that Daniel, since Judaism agrees on the mathematical approach to Daniel 9, okay, the only reason they get to a different resultant point is because their starting point for adding the 490 years on is different. If Judaism was to accept, okay, fine, what we said was an error, First Temple fell in 587, blah, 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 and they still applied the same maths that they have used for their own calculations up till now, they would come to, as Christians do, to the year that Jesus died, which would be 27 AD. King Artaxerxes made the decree to rebuild Jerusalem street and wall, like Daniel 9 says. King Artaxerxes' decree is described in the Tanakh as, sorry, my door came open. Let me just close it. windy today. So, and just to say quickly, King Artaxerxes' decree is recorded in the Tanakh, and the verses even specify rebuilding street and walls, that it was being done and that it was done. History verifies not only that those things occurred, but that King Artaxerxes did make that decree. They can even pinpoint when he made that decree, and it was 457 BC. And when you apply the simple maths to it, that means the 483rd year is 27 AD. Okay, so this would have been, according to Christians, when Jesus died. Now, we get to another sub-argument in this Daniel 9 passage with Judaism. They say that, oh, this is just an anointed guy. It's not, some priest or whatever. It doesn't mean the Messiah. Okay, so I have two responses to this. Number one, the Tanakh itself is very, very little where it talks about the Messiah at all. Judaism knows this, right? There's not much said about the Messiah in the Tanakh. And what is said is not really overtly describing Messiah. It's kind of either poetically or loosely or very briefly. Okay? So we don't have like pages describing Messiah and all this detail is my point, right? Now, since we have, let's just call it a handful of description about Messiah or criteria about like any information about Messiah, just a handful of information about Messiah, it's very important to reflect on the fact that we're talking about Messiah, Mashiach, and yes, anybody could be anointed. That's what the word means. We all know that, okay? But we cannot ignore the fact that if we both call this figure Messiah, then it should be of high relevance when the Tanakh uses that term about, uses that term. Okay, now, yes, it uses the term an anointed one or anointed ones numerous times in the Tanakh. We read the passages, look at context. We look at Daniel 9 here. It would seem very, very pointless, one could say, to just mention that an anointed one would be cut off. It's not mentioning king or priest or somebody specific. It's just saying an anointed one will be cut off. Well, I want to mention as well, the text doesn't just say anointed. It says Mashiach Nagid, right? So two things here. Number one, out of the handful of verses that describe Messiah in the whole of the Tanakh, only a couple or a few at the most, maybe just one or two, mention or even use the term Messiah. So even in the verses that Judaism says talk about Messiah, none of them, except for one or two, actually, I think none of them even use the term Messiah, ironically. It will use branch or something else, right? And what I'm trying to point out here is that the one or two places where the term Messiah is used, Judaism chooses to say, oh, it's not about Messiah, for whatever reasons. Now, in Daniel 9 is this one example. It's talking about an anointed one will be cut off, right? So, but they don't believe it's about the Messiah. So that brings me to step two. Step two is it's Mashiach Nagid in the Hebrew. This isn't just an anointed one. It's an anointed ruler, leader, prince, or whatever, right? That's the definition of the term. So Mashiach Nagid is cut off, right? So this should help pinpoint the figure. I mean, if anybody who deserving and fitting can be anointed, so in theory, lots of different types of people or people could have been anointed and could be anointed at any one time. Just saying an anointed one being cut off is rather ambiguous, right? But it says Mashiach Nagid is cut off. So this narrows it down to who it could be, is my point. And if we know, like I said, or at least consider for Judaism's sake, right? In Judaism's case, sorry, if we at least consider that the temple did fall in 587, their calendar, the Hebrew calendar, does have that error, and the proper accepted, understanding and maths applied show that this figure, whoever it is, was cut off around 27 AD. Okay, then we have to look at history and look at who was there in 27 AD and who was cut off at that time. And if you do that, there was nobody of any noteworthiness who was cut off at that time except for Jesus. Okay, there's always going to be some anointed guy who's cut off from some type of position. But for the Tanakh to mention it, and in a prophecy, and in a very important prophecy, it shouldn't just be some anointed guy. Okay, but it does say Mashiach Nagid. Now, the important thing is this. With each one of these passages, by itself doesn't act as the ultimate evidence for Jesus being Messiah, of course. It's when you see the connections between all of them. So in Daniel 9, what is Daniel 9 talking about? Even Judaism says Daniel 9 describes when Israel will be invaded and overthrown, and this is commonly accepted to be done by the Romans in 70 AD. Okay, so even Judaism accepts that's what the Daniel 9 passage is about. Okay, then what we need to then apply is the following. So what Daniel 9 is showing us is the same thing as Malachi. As I stated, Malachi told us that the Messiah would be here before Israel is smitten. What does Daniel 9 say? Daniel 9, as I'm saying, states that the Messiah, the ruler, Mashiach Nagid, Mashiach the leader, okay, the Messiah, and not just some anointed guy, would be there. And we have the same type of scenario occurring as in Malachi. We have warnings, threats being given through prophets to Israel saying, hey, you better reform or the lands can be smitten. We see that not just in Malachi, but also in Daniel 9 there. So we have the same setting and scenario that's going on here. This is what I mean by connections between all of these, right? So Daniel 9 verbatim describes Mashiach, Messiah, Nagid, at a certain time in history before the fall of Israel. Same thing that Malachi talks about. And Malachi even mentions that when Israel is smitten, that the root and branch will be destroyed, will be burned up, okay, will be cut off, which aligns with what Daniel 9 talks about, that the Mashiach Nagid will be cut off, because one of the terms used by Tanakh to describe the Messiah is root and branch. And even Judaism accepts this. They accept the branch verses in Jeremiah as being about the Messiah and so forth, right? So if root and branch, and I looked up all the uses of these terms in the Tanakh as well, right? I know that the evidence lays in favor on my side of the argument here, right? Those terms are not used widely. They're only used in a few places, right? It helps highlight the Messiah when it's using these certain terms. So when it says root and branch are, they're essentially cut off in Malachi's prophecy, this is exactly what Daniel's talking about. We have the Messiah, the Mashiach Nagid, who is the root, the branch, and it will be cut off, Daniel says, just like how Malachi says it will be cut off, right? So what's another example from So that's Daniel and that. So if we then go down to Isaiah 52 and 53. And one other quick thing. Judaism has also argued, like I mentioned earlier, that being cut off doesn't necessarily mean dying. It can mean anything else. Whilst that might be true, if you look at its use of that term in the Tanakh, like that specific Hebrew term used there for cut off, it is used in numerous other applications where someone or something is dying and actually being cut off. And you can also, in all fairness, it could be describing that the Messiah dies, right? Not just that he's removed from office or that somebody's removed from office. It could be that the person is dying, and that term has been used elsewhere in Tanakh for when something or someone is dying. So that's entirely possible. Okay, but on to the next point. Isaiah 52 and Isaiah 53. We're talking about places in the prophets where it talks about the Messiah. Okay, now in Isaiah 52 and 53, it's not talking about the fall of Israel in this passage here. However, it's still talking about the Messiah figure. Okay, and he is called the root. And one thing I wanted to point out here is I looked up every example of root and branch, okay, and the other related terms. And what I found is that in every occurrence except for one, we find a neat divide of the root, the verses that mention root in regards to a Messiah-like figure. These are fitting and pertain to the first arrival of Messiah, which would be before the fall of Israel. Okay? And if we look at all the examples of branch, they're fitting and pertain to the one that comes at the end of days. Okay? It's a very neat divide, and the only one that doesn't fit is in Isaiah 11, I think around verse 10, where it says that a rod from its root is fruitful, right? Or something like that. And what it does there in that passage is it actually uses the three different messianic terms. It mentions about, this rod, coming forth from there. the branch from the root, and all of that. So by using all of these terms together, and the fact that it's showing you the symbolism of how a branch grows from a root, when you have a sapling twig and it falls to the ground, it grows roots. The roots are going down, and then from the root going up comes the branch, right? And it's going to become fruitful, right? So I think what it's revealing there is root, and I can better explain, is the first arrival of Messiah, and the branch is the final, what is the second arrival of Messiah. So the root and the branch, and that one-off verse that doesn't fit with those neat divides, I think is just the perfect divider, because it mentions all of the terms in Isaiah 11 there, and it's showing you the symbolic progression of the branch from the root, right? So the root would be the first coming of Messiah, the one that would have to come before the fall of Israel, and the branch is the one that shows up at the end of days. Okay, so what's the next point that I want to make? Okay, so in Isaiah 52 and Isaiah 53, these are also about, these ones here mention the servant figure being the root, how he would sprinkle nations. That doesn't mention covenant, but sprinkling the peoples was done at covenants and covenant making. So this fits with Malachi, where it talks about this Messiah figure coming along with a covenant or bringing the covenant, and dying. How Daniel 9 also mentions, I believe, covenant, the Messiah figure, and dying. Now in Isaiah 52 and 53, they're not talking about the fall of Israel, but they're still talking about a Messiah figure bringing or coming along with a covenant, and this figure dying, right? So we have all these connections through all these things, right? In Isaiah 9 is another place, like in Malachi, where it says that, where is it? Where it talks about that God will cut off the branch, he will cut off from Israel head and tail, branch and reed in the same day. Elder, except to the face, he is the head, the prophet, teacher of falsehood, he is the tail, right? It identifies the head and the tail, but it doesn't identify branch and reed. This would be because branch and reed, I can't remember what the Hebrew term for reed is, but I looked it up. Right? These are applying, what I would argue, are applying to the Messiah. So it's just another example of where God warned that this would occur. And you don't have these things occurring, whether it's the land, the people, or even the Messiah being smitten, okay, at the time of restoration and ingathering. These are two separate things, right? So what we have to realize is that the first time Messiah comes is before the fall of Israel. At the fall of Israel, historically confirmed, the people were scattered throughout the world. So the Tanakh actually reveals that Messiah would come before the fall of Israel, before the scattering of Israel. Okay, but the Tanakh also has verses where it talks about the branch form of the Messiah, who would come at the end of days when there is the great arrival, as per Ezekiel. Okay, you have the forces of God, you have Messiah come, you have the great battle that will take place, hail coming down even. We have all this dramatic stuff taking place. It'll be the judgment. And then we'll have the full ingathering of the children of Israel coming back to Israel. In its own, progress in time, there'll be the restoration of Israel and even the whole earth. And it'll be a huge monumental time. Okay. And that's when the branch will arrive to do all of that. I can't remember why I went down that tangent. But one other thing I want to point out, because I will undoubtedly forget later, is that I think people too quickly overlook and forget that Isaiah, and perhaps even elsewhere, talk about a new earth. The heavens will be rolled up like a scroll. Okay, and maybe the talk even mentions, fire in the skies. I know it talks about the skies looking blood red and pillars of smoke, right? But whether it mentions fire or if that's New Testament, I can't remember off the top of my head. But it does mention hail coming down and all of that. We're going to have all these cataclysmic type events taking place in the earth. Tanakh also mentions, mountains being leveled down, places being turned into a plain, the Mount of Olives splitting beneath, right? Regions will be changing. The Tanakh mentions all this type of stuff. It talks about how the sun will increase its brightness, how it will decrease, how the moon brightness will decrease. It talks about all sorts of type of cataclysmic and celestial events that will be taking place. This is not a case, and the reason I'm pointing this out is because that is what Judaism teaches. That is Judaism, i.e., that is in Tanakh. But at the debates, Judaism always likes to make it look like Jesus failed to be the Messiah because the Messiah is supposed to gather all the people in his day and do all this. They portray it like you're going to have somebody like a ruler or somebody, like physically in Israel now will just step up to the podium, get voted in or something. They make it sound so earthly when I think, you have to understand that at this time we're going to have global cataclysms. The world landscape will be physically changing. There will be a judgment across the earth against all of the wicked, right? We're going to have these monumental things, the heavens rolling up and a new earth. Whether we're going to another new earth somewhere else or whether this one will be renewed to be the new earth doesn't matter. Whichever case, these are huge changes. You're not going to have some guy come out in a suit or whatever, in a priestly outfit, and just come be this mundane figure who arrives to be the Messiah. But that's what Judaism presents it like. Some in Judaism acknowledge Messiah may come from the heavens, right? But that's like a minority, right? So the majority in Judaism just think it's going to be this regular type guy, so to speak, and he's going to show up. But how is a person going to get world rulership and world peace and world recognition of Israel and all? How is one normal person going to achieve all of that during a time of global cataclysm? That just doesn't really seem realistic. That seems like a far-fetched fairy tale that someone mundane could achieve and pull off such a success like that. Okay? It's hopes so high that it's unrealistic, right? So I just wanted to mention that, right? And if we look in Ezekiel, we can also see that clearly before the end days arrive, whatever you want to call it, the judgment, the arrival of the forces of God with Messiah, but whatever you want to call it or term it as or fuss over, in Ezekiel it says that the people will have returned to Israel and will be living there to some degree of peace before the armies of Gog Magog attack them. And even in Judaism today, they are finally accepting and they're stating themselves, not all of them, but many, are stating that Israel, the prophecies with Ezekiel there are being fulfilled with the conflict going on with Israel. So in short, I agree. I called it months and months in advance to, the various rabbis are saying that now. But even in Judaism, we're seeing people acknowledge, even rabbis acknowledge that Ezekiel's prophecy is coming true. And plus, even ignoring that, just common sense, we know that in 1948, Israel was reborn, okay, and they've been physically living, many have been physically living there. I mean, this is just daily life for people, right? So that's a fact. So, but the Bible did say that before the end and the Messiah and all that comes, that such a thing would occur, that Israel would be restored and the people would return and live there, but not all of them, that the great total final gathering would happen at the end. So let us draw attention to that Ezekiel told us that Israel would actually be restored prior to the Messiah coming at the end of days. This is what I would want to draw attention to. So Israel would be restored before them. That'll be important for later in my conversation, right? Now, if we then go down to, let's see, even in Zechariah, where is it? Sorry, I've got so many verses here. It's like pages and pages and pages of material. One sec. So the Jeremiah shoot branches, like I've said in my other videos, they're talking about that branch form of Messiah, the one that comes at the end of days, right? So all the occurrences of branch, the term sema, are, for example, in Jeremiah 23 and Jeremiah 33, all these cases are describing the end days events, right? What takes place at the end of days, the so-called end of days. I just had a feeling there were other verses. Okay, so yeah, in Zechariah, right? The wounded figure, which Christians argue is Messiah, coincide, and even historically in Judaism, many believe that this was about a Messiah figure. But anyways, in Zechariah here, the wounded figure, who I argue is Messiah, it coincides with the refining of the people, which agrees with what Malachi said would occur. Okay, So Malachi says that the people needed to be refined. Even Daniel said that the people needed to be refined before God smites the land. Okay, and what do we see here in Zechariah? Another one of the prophets, the same thing. The Messiah figure will be coming at a time when the people need refinement, okay, prior to the destruction, to the fall of Israel. Okay, so Zechariah, well, I'll read this one verse, Zechariah 13:6. And one has said unto him, what are these wounds in thy hands? And he said, because I was smitten at home by my lovers. Sword awake against my shepherd and against the hero, my fellow, an affirmation of God of hosts. Smite the shepherd, and scattered is the flock, and I put back my hand on the little one. So again, this is talking about, as I would argue, the Messiah figure being present in Israel at a time when they need to reform before Israel is smitten and they are scattered. Right? So the same thing as Daniel 9 and as all the other examples that I gave, right? And it goes on, and it has come to pass in all the land an affirmation of God. Two parts in it are cut off, they expire, and the third is left in it. And I have brought the third into fire and refined them like a refining of silver. Okay? So it even talks about refining like that in Malachi. So clearly we could see these connections here, right? Like I was saying, they can't just be ignored. There would be a Messiah-like figure coming to Israel at a critical time before Israel was about to fall, and it would be a last minute, time period in which Israel was to reform, perhaps to spare themselves from the smiting, right? That's why Messiah was sent there, why Elijah was sent there, to help refine the people and prepare them, right? But unfortunately, what ended up happening was uh, they didn't earn it, and we see as history shows, right? Unfortunately, right? But also Messiah was rejected, was rejected and opposed, and was put to death as well, which is just an added unfortunate thing that occurred, right? It's just something extra, an extra additional bad thing that occurred, right? But I think even arguably, maybe even aside from Messiah, even if Messiah didn't arrive, one could argue that Israel was told by God that they have this time in which to reform, and if they don't, Israel will be smitten. So really, Messiah was just thrown in the mix by God to help them out, right? So even if you didn't arguably, if arguably, hypothetically, even if Messiah wasn't part of this scenario, let's just say God decided, I'm not going to send the Messiah to help refine the people before and help refine the world, right? Israel still had the option from God. Either they reform and they're spared, or if they don't reform and they will be smitten, right? And we know what happened in history. And that's why I clarified before, Jesus did not magically make Israel full, especially 40 years after his death. Judaism argues Jesus was a fraud and was just a regular person. Okay, and especially if he was just a regular person or a fraud, he could not make Israel full 40 years after his death. So the fact that Israel fell is just something that would have occurred, nothing to do with Jesus, but because of the guilt of the people of Israel. Okay, that's what made Israel full, right? So, but God had mercy, in my opinion, and sent them Messiah. And this was warned to us in Daniel, it was warned to us in Malachi, it was warned to us in Isaiah, it was even warned to us in Zechariah. Okay, all these places, and there's probably more that I mean, for example, in Micah 6:13 was an example I mentioned earlier, where it says, and I also have begun to smite thee, to make desolate because of thy sins. So for anybody who would say, oh, well, when God in Malachi said, I would come and utterly smite the land, it's not the fall of Israel, you're ridiculous. No, it definitely was, because the same term for smite is here in Micah, and God is saying in Micah here that God will smite thee to make desolate because of thy sins, right? So that's how I know that I'm correct there. Malachi is definitely talking about that, okay? So Malachi talked about it, Daniel talked about it, and specified the year in which it would occur, the Messiah being cut off, right? And that shortly thereafter, Israel will be invaded and overthrown. So we were forewarned in the Tanakh that this would occur, okay? Daniel and Malachi are the most explicit places that talk about the Messiah's necessity to come before the fall of Israel and the purpose of it, which is to refine the people, okay? We have supporting verses like from Isaiah and even from Zechariah and elsewhere, which add support into it because they have verses that talk about the same Messiah-like figure bringing a covenant, okay? And that Messiah figure will suffer, will be opposed, and will die, right? So there's plenty of evidence for that. But going on, the next major point in this scope for today is that, so let's just pretend for the sake of this argument, okay, so Judaism say if I'm speaking to a rabbi says, okay, fine, this is interesting. Maybe Tanakh did say the Messiah will come around then, before the fall of Israel. And okay, fine, maybe you're right with Daniel, and it did pinpoint the year. Okay, well, this looks like, Jesus was there at the right time. But was Jesus savvy to this type of maths and thought, okay, I'll pretend to be the Messiah because I'm here at the right time? You know what I mean? What outside of that can prove Jesus or validate Jesus was the Messiah? Because what does Messiah have to do according to Judaism? Judaism says that Messiah will gather all of Israel, that he will restore Israel and rule the world and bring the world to all peace. And they say that Jesus he didn't do any of that, and that he died failing to do any of that. So Judaism presents their argument as being so tough sounding, like, oh, there's no way Jesus could be Messiah. It's preposterous. All of the things Messiah is supposed to do, Jesus failed to do, and Jesus died like a failure. This is what Judaism says, right? My counter to that is that, well, no, we were told Messiah would die. We were told in Daniel 9. We were told in the same Malachi verse, the branch would be cut off. The root and branch would be cut off. We were told in Isaiah elsewhere that the root branch would be cut off. We were told in Isaiah 53, right? Saving time and justifying that passage as well. We were told in many places that the Messiah would die. So if Tanakh did tell us the Messiah would be here before the fall of Israel, when he would be here, and that he would be opposed, and that he would die, this highlights Jesus very, very well. But what outside of that is my point? Well, Jesus would have to have had success in gathering Israel. Did he? Well, yes, I'll explain. Did Jesus have success in conquering the world and bringing the light of God to the nations? Yes, he did. And that's a separate argument. I don't have time for it today, right? This does a scope video, right? I didn't get into the light of the nations and the many places in Isaiah, right? But Messiah needs to do these things. That's another sub-argument, right? So for Jesus to be the Messiah, it's easy for Judaism to say, well, Jesus died and he's not here ruling the earth eternally with world peace, so he's a failure. Well, no, those things are supposed to happen at the end of days, right? So I agree with Judaism on what Messiah will do at the end of days. I agree with them on that, right? But the only difference with me is that I'm saying, well, no, Tanakh told us that Messiah would also arrive before the fall of Israel. He would come before the fall and scattering, and then come again before the ingathering, right? Two totally different hemispheres, but the same one Messiah. That's why Messiah is called root and then branch. The root comes first, and then the branch grows from the root, okay? So that's what I'm saying. And it's not that God wanted Messiah to be opposed. Israel was going to be smitten. They needed to reform. God sent them assistance, help. Okay, he sent them this figure, the Messiah. The Messiah would help them and the Elijah. But right, focusing on one thing, God would send them the Messiah to help them. Just like Nineveh was given Jonah to teach them to reform. Now, Nineveh did, and they were spared from their smiting. So we have the exact same type of scenario here. Okay, now, so if Jesus isn't here ruling the world, how did he achieve any of these messianic things? Well, yes, the world rule will be put in place at the end of days. The peace around the world will be in place at the end of days. Lion will lay with lamb, and all of this will be in place at the end of days. I believe that. Judaism believes that. I shake Judaism's hand on that. We both agree. There's no argument there. Like I say, the problem is, why did Jesus come first? Well, that was to help warn and prepare people. The important thing I want to relate is that, well, he tried to teach Israel at the time. Thousands did come to Jesus as Messiah in the time, but the rest denied and rejected him. Okay? Now, Jesus also then turned and said, take the light to the Gentiles. He gave command. So I'm not getting into New Testament stuff, but to state a fact, theologically proven in my systematic theology, the true gospel of Christianity at the passage talking about the penultimate event when the Holy Spirit of God came down, and gave the command to go out, through Jesus, through the apostles and disciples, for the apostles and disciples to go out to the world and teach all men everywhere to reform. And this was to teach the whole world is pagan, right? To teach the pagans about the one true God, the God of Israel. Not just any one God, but the God of Israel. And this is what the Christians did. And they only did it because they were commanded to do it by Jesus. And proof of it is in the New Testament, right? So that's just a fact that Judaism doesn't know. They think what the churches have taught since the Dark Ages, that, Jesus is God and all this hoopla, right? But that is not true biblical Christianity, right? So Jesus's true mission, according to actual Christian theology, is that the Christians were commanded to go throughout the world and to spread this light of the one God, right? Is putting the emphasis on the people, responsibility on their shoulders to also do this. Not one man to do everything magically like Judaism expects this mundane person to show up at the end of days, get elected in or whatever, and suddenly start ruling the world and have control over all people. You know what I mean? And again, how is he going to do that if the heavens are going to be rolled up and we're going to a new earth, even if the new earth is this one, and this one's going through cataclysms and physical landscape change? How are you going to do this if you're a mundane, regular person with no special ability and so forth? How is that even going to be possible, right? So, um, it makes sense that, and especially, like I said before, it's not that God wanted Messiah to be opposed and die. It's just an unfortunate consequence of Messiah and other fellow humans. That's just the interactions and what went on and the circumstances, and he ended up dying. Okay, Jesus died because he was a human, right? He wasn't going to be magically protected so that he couldn't die, right? If he was to be opposed, then he could be opposed. He was opposable, and he was dieable. You know what I mean? I don't want to say certain words. He was capable of dying because he was a human. He constantly testified, "I am a son of man like you," right? And evidently he did die, right? As the New Testament says. So evidently he was able to die. He wasn't some special superhuman. Now, I don't need to get into the resurrection thing. That's irrelevant to my argument and evidence here, right? I don't even have to get into that, right? But he was a regular human who was capable of dying and did die. So why would he not be able to die? Why should the Messiah not be able to die? Judaism has the opinion that the Messiah will be eternal. Now, if he's showing up at the end of days after the judgment, where everybody's going to be living these long, blessed lives in the new earth, yeah, then it's fair to assume that he's going to have an eternal type life, or a very long life, or whatever it is that you choose to uniquely believe, right? And fine, yes, and I agree with that too. When he returns, I believe after he resurrected, but that's regardless and irrelevant to this. But when he returns, he will be eternal. So again, I still shake hands and agree with Judaism on what they believe pertaining to an immortal Messiah coming at the end of days. Now, some in Judaism don't believe he'll be immortal. We're not getting into petty side arguments, right? But when Messiah came the first time, the Tanakh tells us he would be opposed, he would suffer, and he would die. It tells us this, and not just in Isaiah 53. It tells us in other places. Okay, so it tells us the Messiah can suffer and die. Okay, and if Messiah is going to suffer and die, how can he therefore rule the world? So what it shows you is that, yes, the Tanakh told us that Messiah is coming twice, once and for all at the end, but he will come before Israel falls 2,000 years prior. Why? To assist Israel and to assist the rest of the planet who are pagans. Now think about this. If Israel had been scattered, which would have occurred whether Jesus existed or not, Israel would have been scattered and fallen in 70 AD because of the actions of Israel and the guilt that Israel had with God. It had nothing to do with Jesus whatsoever, right? I mean, technically, as a Christian, I should argue, Jesus being rejected and put to death incurred guilt. I don't even need to, it probably did. I don't care. I don't need to get into that for this, because regardless of Jesus, the guilt of Israel would have caused those things to happen anyways, right? And furthermore, Judaism doesn't believe Jesus was valid anyways. So my point should ring with them. If Jesus was irrelevant, then Israel fell and would have fallen anyways. Okay, so if we're told that Messiah is going to come before the fall of Israel, that Messiah would die, and that Israel would fall, just picture the world back then. If you were a member of Judaism, a child of Israel back then, you just saw the Romans pillage the land. You're being forced into, if you're one of those who survived and you got to flee, or you went into exile or whatever, and you fled, you were scattered. You were scattered into a world of deep paganism. Everywhere you went in the planet, even if you could reach the other continents, everywhere, everybody was pagan, doing heathen practices and rituals and sacrifices, and having insane, crazy beliefs, some of them even cannibalistic or very sick and perverted, and all sorts of strange, barbaric practices. This was the whole planet. Okay? And so all the Jews who were scattered at that time around 70 AD, okay, and even in the time afterwards, because it didn't all just happen at 70 AD, right? But all of them, that is the environment that they were faced with, a world of paganism. Now, Jesus was a real person, he existed. I argue he was the real Messiah, but inarguably, and even scholars agree now that Jesus must have existed, and they concur that there's more contemporary literature written about Jesus than most other historical figures of noteworthiness, right? So, and after all, the New Testament, the vast majority of the New Testament was written within just decades after Jesus' death, compared to the Tanakh, which was written over a span of over 1,000 years. We don't even have copies. We've lost out. The oldest copies of the Dead Sea Scrolls, and they're like 1,000 plus years off from when they're supposed to have been written in some of the cases, right? Um, so in terms of New Testament, it's quite contemporary to when Jesus, the historical figure, existed. And the like 66 to 70% of the material of the New Testament was written within like 30 or 50 years or whatever, right? And some other few books trailed along in the next other 50 years after that, right? So he definitely existed. Now, since Jesus, he definitely existed, the question remains, was he actually the Messiah or just some guy who thought he was the Messiah? Okay, what's the actual case? Because we don't need to get into resurrection, whether he did or not, whatever. That's irrelevant to this. I'm not talking about it, right? Was he had to exist? If he did exist, was he the Messiah or not? That's still the question, right? We know the Messiah was supposed to suffer and die, and that Israel would fall. So how is Messiah? What is Messiah going to do, and how is he going to achieve it? Messiah is supposed to take the light of God to the Gentiles. So if we know Messiah is supposed to suffer and die, how is he going to take the light of the Gentiles to the whole world when Israel's about to fall? You can't gather Israel like Judaism says Messiah would do. Um, you cannot restore Israel when it's about to fall. You can only do that later, right? That's why I said at the end of days is when the full restoration occurs. It's when the full ingathering occurs. It's when the world global rule and global peace occurs. That's at the end of days. But in 70 AD, Israel was about to fall. And we are told Messiah would appear before that. So if Messiah is supposed to appear, then what I'm getting to, using that, breaking it down logically by talking about it like that, is that before the fall of Israel, it was not the time for the people to be ingathered, logically. It was not the time for Israel to be restored. But since Messiah was said to be there at that time, his purpose at that time was not to restore Israel. His purpose at the time was not to ingather. And that's why when asked about it in the New Testament, the disciples asked Jesus, "Are you here to restore Israel and the people and this and that?" Jesus said, no, and that's not for you to know. The time of those things and God's timing of those things is not for you to know. He never once said anywhere that he would do those things. Okay, this is because the time and purpose of the Messiah at that time in history was not to gather Israel and all of that. It was to help reform and refine them because that day like a furnace was coming. Okay, that was his purpose. So he did his teaching to Israel and he did that first, right? And then, irregardless of whether he got rejected by Israel or not, he didn't get rejected by all Israel because all of the first Christians were Jews. Okay, and they didn't have to go to a new religion, they remained Jewish, right? Because that's how real Christianity works. If you're a Gentile, you adhere to Gentile law, but if you're Jewish and you're a follower of Jesus, you just stay with Judaism because that's what the Jewish Messiah teaches. That's what Jesus taught. All of the first Christians were Jewish. They did not follow a new religion. They did not do anything different. And this is proven in my systematic theology and in the book of Acts, for example, right? So if getting back on track, because I got so much in my mind at once. Um, so if we know that the Messiah was supposed to suffer and die before the fall of Israel, and obviously he's not meant to, as a purpose, gather and restore at that time, what is he going to do? Well, he's supposed to help teach Israel to reform because it's their time of refinement. It's their warning time. It's their time to do it, or else the land's going to be smitten. And he did do that. And he got thousands of followers. Fine. That's a minor thing to point out. The major thing to point out is that the other thing Messiah is supposed to do is take the light to the nations, the rest of the world. The rest of the world is in darkness. They're pagans, steeped in their barbaric paganism. How is that one person, the Messiah, going to change the whole world? Well, he could if he had superpowers. If he could control world events and world conflicts and resolve them magically like a fairy tale, then yeah, even Jesus, who I believe was Messiah, didn't do that. Could he do that? I don't know. Is it fair to say he couldn't do that? Well, he didn't do that. So maybe he couldn't do that. Maybe it is just a fairy tale that one person could do that, resolve all world conflict, get and force all nations to comply and go to one belief. That sounds impossible. But I want to point out something that everybody, and especially Judaism, has taken for granted, especially Judaism, is that if we look at the world today, okay, we all take this for granted now, but we do not live in a pagan world like it was back in the day. And I mean actual paganism. Back in the day, everybody was tribal, even up in Europe, okay, across Asia, across Africa, in every continent, every single person, every tribe was pagan. They believed in a pantheon of deities, okay? There was no monotheism anywhere on the planet. Even Zoroastrianism is not monotheism, okay? There was no, you might have a little tiny little branch here or there that believed in one God, but 99.9% of the planet was pagan. Okay, they didn't know about the Bible. They didn't care about Israel. They didn't know about Israel. Okay, none of them knew anything to do with the Bible. Had no reason to believe in it. That was the whole planet. Okay, and like I said, if Jesus wasn't the Messiah, if Jesus wasn't sent as the Messiah, and Israel was scattered, they would be left in a world of what? Well, there's pagans. Now, if Jesus, the Messiah, wasn't sent to do what he did and to command his followers, whether Jewish or Gentile, to go out to the nations and to do what one person couldn't supernaturally do, okay? But he commanded his followers to go out to the nations, to teach them about the one God, to eradicate the paganism, to teach the people to reform, and to keep the Gentile law, right? Like I'm saying, that is one of the missions and duties and criteria that the Messiah is supposed to do and fulfill. And he commanded that. And what do we see in the world today? Paganism has almost been eradicated from this planet. When you're talking about actual pagan religions, Hinduism still exists. Hinduism is pagan, right? And they have a large population. But they're also a quite peaceful religion, right? And I don't want to point fingers at them and demonize them or anything like that. But yes, they are pagan and they are large, but they are relatively peaceful, right? You know, they believe in a peaceful, righteousness type law system as well. But they're pagan. They believe in lots of gods and statues, and they pray to statues, make offerings to statues, and all sorts of stuff, right? But aside from Hinduism, the only monotheism in the planet is from the biblical religions, right? We have Islam. I'm not getting into Islam, right? So at the time Israel was scattered and fell in 70 AD, the only monotheists in the world were the Jews, and at the time the first Christians, who were all Jewish, and then some early Gentile followers who joined in, right? So the only monotheists were those. And some of them might have been in other countries at the time. So technically speaking, I'm saying it was only in Israel did you have the monotheism. Now Israel fell and was scattered. The people were scattered. So the only monotheism is in those that group. Nowhere else in the world do you have it. And if Jesus didn't exist, and if Jesus had not existed in history and done what he did and commanded the people to do what he commanded, then we would not have a depaganized world today. About 80 to 85% of all the peoples on this planet, all their cultures today are no longer pagan. Okay? And this is only because of the efforts of Jesus. It is only because he existed and did what he did that this has been the direct result. People could say whatever they want. You don't need a high IQ to compute this, because it is a simple historical fact that the only reason the world was depaganized, mechanically depaganized, is it was done by the Christians. Now, some in a not so nice way, like the Catholics, right? The early Christians, for hundreds of years, spread their mission out to the world. There were millions of people who had joined Christianity, okay, before Catholicism showed its face. Okay, Asia Minor, Europe, Upper Africa, the known world of the time, had already gotten millions of people who had come to Christianity prior to Catholicism showing its face. Okay, and this is before the train and the plane. They had boats, but long, far sea travel wasn't done. They hadn't traveled out to North and South America and over to Australia and all these other places back then. Okay, so the known world at the time had that gospel spread throughout it. Okay, everybody else was pagan. Now, it was the Christians, by the command of Jesus, who went out to the world, risking their life and limb, which nobody of sound mind would do unless they were utterly convinced it was necessary. You had all those early Christians risk their life and limb traveling by boat across the ocean, going through jungles, reaching tribes in distant places, tribes who couldn't speak their language. One of the blessings and gifts that God gave them through the Holy Spirit then was the ability to speak in foreign tongues, which has happened at the Pentecost event described in the New Testament. For that period of time, for the purpose of this mission work, God would bless them with the Holy Spirit so that they may speak in the foreign languages, even miraculously, so that wherever they went, they were able to be understood. And allegedly, they also did some miracles. We don't need to worry about whether they did or not. The fact is, they went out on the impression that they had to do this. They risked their life to do this. Imagine going to spread the word of God to Vikings, like I've said a million times. The Vikings will love to chop you up and turn your skull into a wine cup. And you want to come knock on their door telling them about Israel and Jesus and the birthrights of Jacob. You're not going to make it past the doorpost, right? But all these early Christians did this with all the other pagan and violent and barbaric and hostile tribes. They're out there across the world and converted them. And the early Christians didn't do it by sword and force. Jesus, when they went out in the New Testament even, one of the disciples pulled out a sword and attacked an opposer with it. And Jesus said, no, if you slay by the sword, you will die by the sword. You're not to go out and do this mission work by force and violence. You're to do it by inspiration, by wisdom, and by teaching, right? And with the added benefit, if God allows, the miracle of speaking in foreign tongues or the miracle of healing some people. So the people who went around would only be able to do a miracle of healing people. So if someone was injured and they could heal them, that would show the power of God working through them. Because as a Christian, and as Jesus did, it's God who does all the miracles. Jesus didn't do the miracles. He said it was God doing the miracles. Likewise, the disciples were not told, hey, I'm giving you magic powers. You can go do magic stuff. No, it was, you can heal people in the name of God. Ask God to heal that foreigner. And when they are healed, the foreigner knows that God gets the glory because you ask God to do it. That's the important point of those miracles. It's not that Christians have magic powers. So they risked life and limb. They did that. They achieved that because look at the end result. Europe, for example, was all tribal pagans who used to look at bird intestines to read the future. Look at them now, right? Look at even Africa. A lot of Africa has monotheism now, right? Look at Asia, all the other places, de-paganized. And if you look, in almost every case, the de-paganization is because of the efforts of Christianity. Unfortunately, yes, some of which was because of the forceful Catholic influence, right? But that cannot be denied. So the only reason we have a depaganized world, and that took a long time. That was over the progress of near 2,000 years for that depaganization. Okay? Because the known world at the time they had spread to in the first few hundred years, right? But the rest of the planet was much bigger. You needed vehicles to get there that they didn't technologically possess. So over the course of the 2,000 years, the rest of the known world was contacted. So the light of God reached the world. Anywhere on the planet right now, people can get copies of the Bible. They've at least heard about the God of Israel everywhere on the planet. This did not happen because of the Jewish people. The Jewish people did not make that effort to do this. I'm not trying to be mean. My point is, the only reason the whole planet has received the light of God, the knowledge of God, the God of Israel, is because Jesus existed and did what he did as the Messiah. And if Jesus hadn't existed, then the Christians would have never existed. They would have never been commanded to go out and spread monotheism. The world would have remained pagan. A lot of the world was still pagan just a few hundred years ago. Okay, 500 years ago, a lot of the world was still pagan. Okay, the world definitely, without question, if Jesus hadn't existed, would still be pagan. And the only monotheists who ever existed prior to Jesus were the Jews. And where were the Jews at this time? Scattered throughout the world. Israel had fallen. How could they possibly survive? That was the question, anyways, even in the presence of Jesus and the Christian efforts and all that having existed, spreading the knowledge and the light of God. So when one of the Jews is wandering in the exile looking for a place to live, being kicked out from one place to the other, he ends up in a land. He's lucky that that land is no longer pagan. Why? Because the Christian influence had come to it. Oh, when he arrives at that land and knocks on the door, hello, I'm a foreigner. I came from Israel. Israel's fallen. Can I live here? Can I stay here and be part of your peoples? Right? Those people would have heard about the God of Israel, and the only reason they heard about it is because of the efforts of Christianity, which is a result of Jesus. So yes, a lot of Christians did oppose the Jews over the time period as well. That's very, very wrong. That's something separate to this, right? The fact is, if Jesus hadn't existed, none of that depaganization would have occurred. The world wouldn't have heard about the God of Israel. That light of God wouldn't have spread to the nations, and the Jews who were in exile would have been going to lands that were full pagan and who don't know squat about the Bible, and they would not have survived. It was very hard for them to survive. Scholars even say that it's virtually impossible that Israel survived the way that it did. The people of Israel survived this near 2,000 year exile. Imagine how more impossible it would have been if the world was still pagan. Okay, so it cannot be denied that the depaganization of the planet was a result of Jesus. He didn't do it himself, but it cannot be denied that it only occurred because of him. Cannot be denied. Now, because the Christians existed and because they had their imperatives, the true Christian imperative is to honor Israel and the Jewish people and all of that. The false, ignorant Christians demonize them. The truth, because enough Christians have the common sense and wisdom to know that what the Bible says, even in the New Testament, to honor Israel and the Jewish people. That's why millions of Christians risked their lives in the Second World War, such as my own grandparents, to defeat Germany, who were the enemy of the Jewish people. Okay. And not only did the Christian Gentiles win the war defending, the only reason the planet came together to help the Jews out. Why did the planet come together to help the Jews out? The only reason the planet came together to help the Jews out were those Christian nations coming together is because their Christian imperative was to honor Israel and the Jewish people and to protect them. Right? And that's why those Christian nations came together and protected them. They defeated Germany. They won the war. Millions of the Christian Gentile lives lost as self-sacrifices for the sake of the Jewish people. The Jewish people were in peril, being eradicated. They did not save themselves and were not capable of it. They were being eradicated. They were saved by the Christians and others, but by the Christians who sacrificed of their own lives, blood, sweat, and tears for the sake of the Jewish people. And the only reason the Christians did that is because of the Christian imperative, okay, from Jesus. If Jesus had not existed, the world would have been pagan. We probably wouldn't even have technology because most of the scientific, chemistry, and everything, innovation came from Christians, Templars, Rosicrucians, different forms of masonry back in the day, and all of that, who are practicing all these early forms of science, became some of the most, the first published scientists and all of that, mainstream the publication of books and publication of science, bodies of science, international bodies of science. Almost all of this was done through Christians and Christianity, right? So not only did they depaganize the world, but they also helped civilize and step up the world in terms of technology and, progress. And if we didn't have Jesus, we wouldn't have any of that progress. We wouldn't have had the Christian chemists and alchemists who created what we now know as the art of chemistry and science and biology. All this stuff wouldn't have existed. All those inventors who invented things for science, wouldn't have existed. We'd be in the dark ages, paganism, like it was 500 or 1,000 or 1,500 years ago across the planet still. We would not have had progress there, right? Israel, the people of Israel, the Jewish people would have been eradicated if a Germany did exist at the time. Any other type of opponent, such as Islam, who opposed them, they would have been eradicated. There's absolute no question. And the only reason that the Jewish people are still here today is because Jesus existed. And it sounds ridiculous to say by itself like that, but it's absolutely true, right? And also, the restoration of Israel, the rebirth of Israel in 1948, again, that only occurred not because of what the Jewish people did. The rebirth of Israel on paper, legally, internationally approved, was the result of the Christian Gentiles again. And again, if we didn't have Jesus, we wouldn't have that occurring. We wouldn't have a reborn Israel. So if we never had Jesus, the reality is, I want people to appreciate, is that we wouldn't even have Israel today. The Jewish people, some might be there, but they wouldn't be there, because the main the ingathering started after 1948 rebirth of Israel, right? And if an enemy like Germany would have, by fate have risen up, even if Jesus hadn't existed, and we still had another enemy nation, maybe from the Empire of Islam or some other, rise up to go against the Jewish people, like did happen in World War II. If I'm saying in a hypothetical alternate situation, if Hitler hadn't done this, what if another like Hitler had done this? They would have been eradicated, because he wouldn't have had these other nations who would have stepped in to do this. You would in a civilized, progressed world, but the world was only civilized and progressed because of the efforts of Christianity. Okay? People will take offense to that, but I'm not saying that in China and ancient China, their cultures, this and that, there are somewhat okay. I'm not trying to demonize people or even get into that type of context, but from a biblical perspective, there's a way you should live. And, these other cultures might have pretty okay day-to-day life, and they try to be good people, and they have principles of righteousness, but at the same time, they're making offerings to ghosts and spirits, or they're doing witchcraft, and there's all sorts of other things tied into these other cultures, right? That's why in the Tanakh, you're not supposed to, follow the practices of any of the other nations, right? It's for that reason I'm saying it, not to be prejudiced and, cast a dark light on all the other cultures that existed back then. Yes, there were peaceful ones, but they all, as peaceful as they were, they weren't the right way they should be doing things. That's the gist of it. That's my point, right? But Israel exists today because of Jesus. The Jewish people are in Israel today because of Jesus. And it's not ridiculous. It's a simple fact. We wouldn't have those things. The whole world would be pagan. We probably wouldn't even have technology. We probably wouldn't barely be touching on science right now. We'd still be in the dark ages if it wasn't for Jesus. That's just a simple fact. Okay? Jesus didn't make, Rome, people could say, oh, Rome was pretty advanced. Yep. Well, Rome went extinct at the hand of the German Goths, right? Every great empire falls. Egypt was great once and had lots of, technological ability of their time. Look at them now, right? So just because there was somebody advanced at the time doesn't mean that civilization like Rome would have existed for another 2,000 years to our current era to advance us. Okay? Rome fell not that long, couple centuries or whatever after Jesus anyway, so they fell as well. But anyways, we wouldn't have had any of that. We would have all been pagan. So all of us, the whole world needs to thank Jesus for his presence. So what is the Messiah supposed to do? Well, he's supposed to, get global rule. Well, like I said, this is at the end of days. But if we look at the world right now, about 80% of all of the nations of this planet are either under a Christian empire, Christian government, or a Christian type of law system or Bible-based law system. So Christian influence, direct, profound influence in over 80% of the nations of this planet. Now, a lot of those 80% aren't even Christian empires or nations, but they've implemented what is the Christian way that a nation should operate, i.e. Christian form of government, biblical-based form of government or law systems, right? I.e. this and that is wrong. You shouldn't do it. This should be punished, stuff like that, right? 80% of the planet. And again, if we didn't have Jesus, we wouldn't have the Christian empire spreading, conquering, depaganizing the world, and putting a biblical law system in place across the planet. So if we didn't have Jesus, we wouldn't have any of that, right? The 80% of the nations today who have these law systems that we take for granted, we have police and courts. The only reason why we have courts and prisons and legal systems and all that, in part, is because of the Christian influence in spreading the, of a biblical based form of governance to the world. And that did happen. 80% of the planet has it. So that, again, that's another undeniable thing, right? So even though Jesus died, he accomplished a lot. Jesus accomplished the restoration of Israel. Ezekiel said Israel will be restored, the people will go to live there before the end of days and Messiah arrives. Okay? So this complies with that. So Jesus did cause the restoration of Israel. He caused it. He did, undeniably. Not the end of days restoration, but that's the whole planet, not just the land of Israel. If the sky's going to roll up, a new earth happens, that's the end of days, right? But Jesus did cause the restoration of Israel that was supposed to occur, as exampled in Ezekiel. He did cause that, okay? And Jesus did cause the ingathering to start, right? Why? Because look how many people in the world today, even Christians, who want to go to Israel, who want to, be a part of Israel and help Israel. The only reason they feel like that, millions of people, billions of people around the world feel like that because of Jesus and his imperatives that he relayed. Okay? The ingathering of the Jewish people occurred primarily after 1948, or especially after 1948. Again, all of this was because of Jesus. So Jesus did cause the rebirth of Israel, the restoration of Israel. The ingathering, which occurred from the rebirth, again, was caused by Jesus. Okay, Jesus caused the light and knowledge of God to reach the whole world. Everywhere on the planet has access to the understanding of the God of Israel and even copies of the Bible. Again, that was caused by Jesus. Take Jesus out of the equation, none of that would exist. Okay, so those are all things that the Messiah was supposed to do, and he did do them. Yes, they will be at their fullness at the end of days, but look, evidently he already did a good job of causing all of this to occur, which is extremely powerful evidence that he was the Messiah, because nobody else did this. Jesus is the most influential person to ever exist in human history, number one, and nobody will ever usurp him, right? And he's a guy who only lived about 30-something years, died, was never rich, was never holding a position of power or authority. He didn't have any of this to himself. He was a very humble, down-to-earth person, basically a peace-loving hippie who went around teaching people. And yet, 2,000 years later, he's got the most followers of any he's got the largest religion on the planet. 1/3 of Earth's population follows him. So you're talking about the Messiah. One of the criteria of Messiah is that the world would obey him. Well, you have 1/3 of the planet undeniably obeying Jesus, but you want to say Jesus isn't the Messiah. Well, if someone who is the Messiah would have the world obeying him. Now, the fact is, these things are supposed to happen at their fullness at the end of days. The fact is, Messiah was supposed to come before the fall of Israel, blah, 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 like I said before. Jesus was that one. And Jesus, because he was that one, has already got the head start on this. 33% of the world is following the Messiah. Israel has been reborn because of that one. So all of this has already been paved out and started to a large degree by Jesus. 80% of the planet having a biblical-based law system or a Christian governance in place. He already has more than just started, but he's already starting to fully accomplish global rule. And back in the day, there was even a wider Christian empire over the known world, right? So some empires have given up on the Christian alliance, I believe. I could be wrong. Maybe some didn't, right? And gone for their own heritage or whatever, right? Let's just say. But even those who do that still keep the Christian governance system, right? Or law system, right? But so if Messiah is supposed to rule the whole world and have obedience of peoples around the world, we can see that, yeah, whilst that is supposed to fully happen at the end of days, I mean, for heaven's sake, no offense, look at what Jesus has accomplished already and caused. 80% of the world, following the biblical-based law system of governance. God commanded the Gentiles in the Gentile law, and it's repeated in the New Testament, to build courts and all this and that there, and to judge over the people. This is talked about in the Tanakh and the New Testament as a requirement of Israel and the Gentiles, right? And the Christian empire set such things up. Courts, judges. This was based on, the biblical verses saying that they should do such. This is what the Christian empire set up. This was set up around the world. And that's why around the world, even in impoverished nations, they have courts and Bible-based law systems and penalties for things and police and prisons and all of that. All of this came. This control, this global rule, all of these laws, whilst we don't have global peace outright, that will come at the end of days after everything is done, we have made profound steps towards that. The fact that there are courts and judges and police and prisons and law systems have prevented a lot of chaos and crime and sin and darkness in the world. It's easy to say, the world is full of darkness and evil, and it is. But the average person is good and doesn't do bad stuff, right? We should give people more credit than we are. There's a lot of bad in the world, but also a lot of that bad is being highlighted and pushed in our faces on TV and on media, right? I would like to say the majority of the planet is good, right? I'm not saying perfect, but good. I would like to say that badness, bad behavior, evil, all that falls under a minority portion. And this is because those things are kept in order by judges, courts, police, laws, and all of that being maintained. And the only reason we have those things is because of the Christian empires and their imperative to do such that was laid down by Jesus. So again, if we didn't have Jesus, we wouldn't have any of this stuff. All these things that we take for granted, the order in our lives. Back in the day, you go outside, anybody from anywhere could come and rob you, slay your family, steal your wife and children, take them as slaves. We live in a world where those things are illegal. You know what I mean? So, and yes, obviously other countries had their own laws, but again, 80% of the planet, it's a fact, is either Christian empire, Christian ruled, or at least has a government system or at least a law system that's Bible based. And the only reason, even at the minimum of having a Bible based law system, the only reason they have that is not because of the Jewish people, because of the efforts of Christianity, because Jesus. Okay, period. This is my point, right? So you always have a few exceptions or anomalies in some things, but the vast majority of cases, there you go, that's excellent evidence. So all the things that the Messiah was supposed to do and attain at the end of days, Jesus has actually already started. Okay, that's because one of the things Messiah was supposed to do when he was here the first time is to take the light to the nations. And this is what Jesus did. Sorry, with his command and imperatives. We can see that those commands and imperatives were efficient, they worked, they were successful, they were victorious, and the world today we have because of those efforts. So Messiah, Jesus paved the way. The very fact that the Jewish people now are even having the Gog Magog war unfolding is because they are in the reborn Israel. This prophecy wouldn't even be able to be fulfilled if Jesus hadn't existed and done what he did. If Jesus hadn't existed and done what he did, we would not have the reborn Israel that we have today. So it would still be off in the air, ambiguous, a question mark as to whether and when Israel would be restored. But the fact is, folks, that the people are in Israel again now. Israel was reborn and restored. Those are the facts, the undeniable facts. Those things happened. The Bible said that those things would happen. And the Bible said that the Messiah would cause those things, and Jesus is the one who caused those things. So when you look at the tangible evidence in the world, it's evident that Jesus is the Messiah. He didn't violate or fail the things. He upheld them and fulfilled the things that are said to be about Messiah. Okay? And the only things that have yet to be fulfilled is for the war mentioned in Ezekiel to come to its final point, and for the end days and the judgment to arrive. And then the world goes into the cataclysms that it will. The judgment occurs. Then you have all these penultimate events occurring. That's when the branch, the final appearance of Messiah occurs. This is when Messiah comes as the branch at the very, very end. The ensign goes up, and that's when all of the people of Israel and the chosen will be gathered from around the world. And like God says in Isaiah, we'll get a new earth. We'll go to a new earth, and the former won't even be remembered or thought of. This is a huge time of change. Okay, so Jesus did not fail to be Messiah. Nobody else in history has been as influential as him. Okay, nobody at all. He's not just been influential. He's not just popular because of his hair or because of his talk. He is so influential that he is the largest religion. Like I said before, these are very important things to dwell and understand, right? The largest religion, the largest number of followers, the most popular and influential person to ever exist. All of these accolades, Jesus. Nobody else comes close. If Jesus was a fraud and if he wasn't the Messiah, how could a mundane, regular person who lived 30 something years and died pathetically, one could say, how could he attain all this 2,000 years later is ridiculous. The fact that anybody could attain so much 2,000 years later, and you take the biggest, most powerful people from any point in history, Genghis Khan, Napoleon, Julius Caesar, all these rulers, they dwindled. Even the pharaohs, they dwindled in their popularity decades after they died. People stopped caring about them. With Jesus, it's the polar opposite. He's only increased in popularity, increased in followers, increased in influence to the point where 1/3 of the planet follows him. 1/2 of the planet in total believes him to some degree, okay, and is inspired by him. Even New Agers are, right? To have half the planet looking to you, to have 80% of the planet complying with a law system based on your teachings, to have spread the knowledge of God to the whole planet, made the word of God available to the whole planet, to defending the Jewish people and saving their lives and existence in the world war and rebirthing Israel, causing the ingathering of the Jews, depaganizing the planet. These are the reasons why Jesus was the Messiah. This is why he was the Messiah. Who else has been as popular? Who else has achieved those unachievable things? Nobody has ever in history, ever come close and ever will. And the only reason those things are achievable by this otherwise mundane, normal Son of Man person is because God was behind it all. That's why these miraculously successful things occurred, is because God was behind it, empowering it, because it's part of his plan. So, anyways, I'll take care. Take care, folks. I gotta go. God bless you all, and see you all later. And hopefully Patrick is okay and we're back soon one day. Good to see you, Alan and Elijah or Eli. Take care, folks. God bless. Thanks for coming.